The unsettling hum of whispers persisted among those who understood the things most don't want to know. I'd always prided myself on dodging the dark web of the intelligence community, but even with my knack for disappearing beneath the radar, they had a way of catching up. I'd chosen a pseudonym, Hawkeye, not for the cliched symbolism, but because my past had eyes everywhere, and those very eyes were likely narrowing on this communication right now. Each word I write is a risk, a chance I take to make sure the story gets out. But bear in mind, dear reader, that the names have been changed, not only to protect me, but also for the sake of those who had loved ones intertwined with this, loved ones who might stumble upon this revelation and be shattered by the truth. But where to start? The tale, as with most legends of my life, began in a place where dreams were stolen and the sand whispered secrets. Afghanistan, 2015. A time when my Green Berets unit, which had been weaving in and out of that unforgiving land for 3 long years, was once again on the ground. Despite the reassuring talk from Washington about troop withdrawals and peaceful transitions, those of us in the know understood the situation better. Our operations had simply shifted from being overt to covert. Most of the world didn't recognize the intricacies of the United States Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC umbrella, under which multiple forces operated. But my brothers and I, from various branches of the military, knew. There might even have been some Coast Guard souls in the mix. Every man played his part. Our roles weren't the standard military operations you saw on TV. As one of my instructors used to quip with a sinister grin, we deliver nightmares to those who deserve them. We weren't there for diplomacy. We were the unseen hands that acted swiftly and silently. I recall those freezing nights, hours spent on the rugged terrains of the Afghan mountains, keeping a vigilant watch. Observing even the most mundane activities of suspected insurgents became crucial because, as we'd learned, even a simple act could be the key to unlocking bigger plots. And then, everything changed. The day that shadowy CIA agent arrived at our forward operating base was a day that none of us would forget. From his first words, our skepticism was palpable. Every classified operation was said to be the most important, but something about this man's presence felt different. He unveiled a mosaic of intelligence. Photographs, call transcripts, surveillance footage, each fragment revealing an alarming picture. It was all about the Brotherhood, an entity not as widespread in the public consciousness as Al-Qaeda, but just as, if not more, dangerous. Their ambitions had evolved from extremist rhetoric to a deadly tangibility. They'd somehow acquired weapon-grade plutonium from a former Soviet general. This wasn't just another terror threat. They'd successfully brokered a deal for the deadliest weapon of mass destruction. Last tracked near the Afghan border, they'd vanished like smoke, disappearing into the vastness of the mountains. It was our duty, our curse, to find them and stop whatever cataclysm they had in the making. This was the inception of Operation Falcon. The mission, in essence, was straightforward enough. Track down these malicious shadows, neutralize the threat, and reclaim the plutonium. Yet the reality was more daunting. The treacherous mountainous terrain, vast stretches without a friendly face, and the omnipresent echo of an enemy nearby. It felt like an uphill battle in every sense. In the hush of the night, our tactical minds came alive. Strategies bounced off the walls of the temporary headquarters, each one dissected and examined. We finally converged on a plan, one as daring as it was simple. A 10-man squad would be helicoptered close to the last known location of the Brotherhood. They'd proceed on foot, engage, secure, and finally extract. It might have been tempting to send a full army, but a larger force would only make us more conspicuous. The agility and stealth of a 10-man team was our best bet. I stepped forward, not out of a misplaced sense of heroism or longing for adrenaline, but sheer restlessness. Weeks of just surveillance had dulled my senses, and I felt that hunger to be in the heart of action. Besides, I was equipped with specialized training to handle chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear (CBRN) threats. Once our team was assembled, the ensuing hours were a blur of intensive planning. There was a shared acknowledgement that while you can prepare for most outcomes, the battlefield always throws the unpredictable at you. As Tyson famously said, "All plans are good, until the first blow lands. Bathed in the silvery light of a full moon, our preparations took form. I wrapped myself tightly against the biting cold as the whir of the Chinook's rotor blades began its crescendo. Some soldiers engaged in hushed conversations, some were lost in their thoughts, but I chose to drift into a short, fitful sleep. An unscheduled nap, I reasoned, was sometimes a soldier's best ally. The sudden shake of Derek, our leader, stirred me awake. 10 minutes to LZ, he murmured. As I adjusted my night vision goggles, the world transformed into shades of eerie green. The helicopter began its descent, with the fierce mountain winds tossing it around as if it were no more substantial than a leaf. Yet, our pilot, displaying nerves of steel, ensured we touched ground safely. Within moments, we made our exit, engulfed by gusts of snow and ice as the Chinook took off, its silhouette vanishing into the vast night. There we were, in the heart of the mountains, enveloped in an almost sacred silence, punctuated only by the wind's mournful howls. The snow, soft and fleeting, crunched beneath our boots as we advanced uphill, guided solely by the green hues of our goggles. By the time we reached our initial checkpoint, a jagged outcrop on the mountainside, the exhaustion was palpable. Victor, our communications expert, quickly connected with command. My lungs burned, a sensation all too familiar from my Colorado upbringing, yet this altitude added an entirely new dimension to the strain. Victor's thumbs up signified clear instructions. No new intel. Proceed as planned. As dawn threatened to paint the sky, we ventured forth, determined, into the heart of the unknown. We pressed on, our resolve tested with every step. After what felt like an eternity, but was in fact a mere few hours, we had barely covered 2 miles. Every muscle ached, every nerve screamed for respite. Yet despite our fatigued states, the mission and its importance anchored us, giving us a purpose that pushed back the exhaustion. We descended into a draw, one that served as a guiding path toward the last recorded whereabouts of the target. As we delved deeper, the icy, barren stretches transformed into sparse forests with interspersed patches of pine and shrubbery. While these trees offered some semblance of concealment, the rising sun hinted at the danger the daylight brought. We knew all too well that dawn was when insurgent activity peaked. Gathering around Derek, we dropped to our knees, forming an impromptu huddle. He outlined the dilemma: pressing on and risking exposure in broad daylight, or waiting under the cloak of nightfall with the inherent dangers that came with navigating in the dark. Even though Derek held the rank, decisions were always a collective effort. Our bond transcended military hierarchy. Our medic Neil was the first to voice his thoughts, emphasizing the perils of maneuvering through such rugged terrain in the dark. I voiced my agreement, aware of how our night vision equipment, although useful, could distort depth perception. Victor concurred, remembering the challenges we had faced during our insertion. The consensus was clear. We would advance in daylight. As the first rays of the sun painted the landscape in hues of gold, we embraced the shadows, using them as a natural camouflage while vigilantly scanning our surroundings. In these highlands, the enemy was a master of deception, capable of concealing entire camps, making them nearly invisible until one was fatally close. The ground turned traitor, with loose rocks shifting treacherously beneath our boots. The inevitable happened. I took a misstep, ground gave way, and suddenly, I was in freefall. My descent was a whirl of confusion and desperation, ending when I managed to grab a slender pine sapling. Its thin frame bent under my weight, but held strong. After a heart-stopping moment, I managed to pull myself up, checking for any injuries or damage. Derek, ever the protective leader, rushed to my side, ready to lend a hand. But as I moved to grasp it, his expression morphed into one of sheer horror. His gaze fixed on something behind me, his face drained of color. Swiveling around, I too saw it, and a chilling jolt of adrenaline surged, making every nerve in my body scream in alarm. Nestled beneath the outcrop, an unsettling sight greeted me. Merely a few feet away lay the lifeless body of a man, his attire a blend of traditional African garments. The very earth around him narrated a chilling story. Splatters of blood adorned the nearby rocks, and a closer inspection revealed the grisly extent of his injuries. His skull was gruesomely disfigured, the left eyeball gruesomely hanging by a thread, a chilling testament to the brutality of his end. His jaw was contorted grotesquely, while bloodied ribs protruded through his winter attire. Instinctively, my rifle had risen, its aim fixed on the deceased, perhaps out of an ingrained reflex from countless missions. I steadied myself, lowering the weapon as Neil approached, examining the body. He flipped it, revealing an AK-47 that had been pinned beneath. To our collective surprise, it was devoid of ammunition. A murmur rippled through the group, with Jacob, one of our machine gunners, suggesting that the man might have met his unfortunate end in a tumble through the rugged terrain. However, another revelation complicated this theory. As Neil maneuvered the body, we witnessed a gruesome wound on his neck, its size and depth profoundly unsettling. Discussions were rife about potential predators, perhaps a coyote or a larger wildcat, having a role in this. But deep down, we knew the manner of injury didn't fit with known predator behavior. Derek's voice pulled us back, reminding us of our primary objective, to stay the course. As we resumed our journey, the surrounding mountains began to come alive with the ambient sounds of nature, perhaps trying to drape a sense of normalcy over the eerie encounter. The path forward became slightly accommodating, leading us onto a ridge that encircled the mountain, but the ascent remained challenging. Trees became our anchors, helping us maintain balance and providing momentary respite. We pressed on, our muscles screaming and our lungs gasping, amplified by the altitude's thinning air. During one such break, as I found solace between two bushes and quenched my thirst, the once serene ambience shattered. The distant staccato of gunfire echoed through the valleys. Every fiber of our being tensed up. Our training kicked in, and we established a defensive perimeter, our ears straining, trying to discern the direction and distance of the gunfire. The firing, initially incessant, reduced to intermittent pops before plunging the mountains into an ominous silence. Victor swiftly radioed our situation, inquiring about any possible air reconnaissance. But the reply was discouraging. All air assets were occupied. There was a palpable sense of frustration, with Derek vocalizing the collective sentiment. Help was sparse, and the mountains had their secrets. The mission wasn't just about navigating the treacherous terrains anymore. The mountains echoed with hidden threats, making our journey even more perilous. For the better part of the next hour, our journey was relatively uneventful. The tranquility was only broken by the sporadic rustling of wildlife or the chilly gusts that stung our faces. The sound of gunfire had ceased, but we remained perpetually alert, pausing intermittently to discern any ominous signals. The terrain transformed as we navigated further, with the ridge giving way to a gradually rising valley that stretched up the mountainside, terminating not far from the peak. The mere thought of having to climb that formidable incline was daunting, but something else soon drew our attention. Derek, with his keen eyes, spotted something peculiar. At his prompting, I fetched my binoculars and identified a small cave entrance higher up the valley. Even more intriguing was a machine gun nest nestled adjacent to the cave, noticeably unmanned. Such a careless oversight was uncharacteristic of the usual Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces we'd encountered. Their cunning and knack for camouflage was legendary, and it was strange to see an exposed position like this without the impending barrage of bullets. Derek looked deep in thought. The situation's strange, but it merits an investigation, he decided. If we find it empty, we can always mark the site for an airstrike later. The ascent that followed was nothing short of grueling. Every step up the steep slope was a battle, the thinning air making each breath a luxury. Midway, Derek's abrupt gesture brought us to an immediate halt. He pointed towards a bunch of trees, where a splash of fabric hinted at something concealed. We approached cautiously, only to be met with another macabre sight. Another body, even more brutally maimed than the previous one. The sight was grotesque, with limbs torn asunder and the man's innards spilling out in a morbid display. The rifle next to him was eerily twisted. Its magazine, much like the previous AK-47, was empty. Jacob, visibly shaken, muttered, "Something's very off here." Derek and I exchanged glances, and I could discern an unfamiliar emotion in his eyes. Amidst the seasoned veteran's gaze, for the first time, lay a hint of bewilderment. He was grappling to piece together the mystery before us, a puzzle that none of us had foreseen. Derek took a moment to let the sight of the gruesomely divided body settle in. Pulling himself together with evident effort, he commanded, "Onwards." But as we advanced higher up the mountainside, more disturbing scenes emerged. Bodies were strewn haphazardly, appearing as if they'd been victims of horrific accidents or were casualties of some monstrous force. Some bore deep, ghastly slashes. Others were grotesquely contorted, and one even dangled eerily from a tree branch high above, its blood still fresh and trickling below. The chilling crunch of shell casings beneath our boots grew more frequent. Weaponry lay abandoned and shattered all around, the destructive aftermath of some inexplicable confrontation. Battle-worn as I was, having witnessed the grim reality of warfare firsthand, this tableau of horror was unlike anything I'd seen before. The primal instinct deep within whispered for retreat, to flee from this unholy ground. But duty prevailed over fear. We had a responsibility to each other and our mission. We eventually reached the machine gun nest, surrounded by the carnage of those who'd presumably manned it. The sight of the gunner, or what remained of him, was especially gut-wrenching. But before I could process it further, Neil's voice pierced the oppressive silence. "Derek, someone's still breathing." We quickly converged on a makeshift shelter, finding a man in dire condition, his insides spilling out, pain and fear evident in his eyes. Bradley, our invaluable translator, approached to glean what he could from the man's final moments. The two conversed urgently, the man occasionally pointing weakly towards the cave, his life force visibly ebbing. As his voice diminished to a murmur, a last breath escaped his lips, sealing his fate. "What did he share, Bradley? Anything about the plutonium?" Derek probed, a sense of urgency tinging his voice. Bradley, typically composed and tan-skinned from the Texan sun, was now ashen, clearly shaken by what he'd just learned. He hesitated momentarily before divulging. "They brought the plutonium here, intending to assemble a bomb, but not for us." The revelation was startling. Jacob interjected, "That's nonsensical." But Bradley, gaze still locked on the foreboding cave entrance, continued. "The tribal elders had always cautioned against this location. They were to avoid it at all costs. Yet they chose to establish their base here, hoping the caves would shield them from us. And in doing so, they awakened something." Derek's patience was wearing thin. "What did they awaken, Bradley?" Taking a deep breath, Bradley responded, "These tribes, they've lived here for generations, since the times predating Alexander the Great. Their oral traditions, ancient tales passed down over millennia, speak of an entity, something older than religion, written language, or any known civilization." Our team was left grappling with the implications, staring into the cave's abyss, the implications of Bradley's words weighing heavily on our minds. The enormity of the situation loomed ahead, casting a shadow that the daylight could not penetrate. Bradley continued, emphasizing the reverence these ancient tribes held for the mountains. These peaks aren't just tall, rocky formations to them. They view them as living entities, guarding secrets and spirits from time immemorial. By setting up camp here, he said, gesturing to the surrounding devastation, they disturbed something deeply sacred, something that was never meant to be awakened. An uneasy hush enveloped us all, the weight of Bradley's words juxtaposed against the very tangible mission we had. It was Derek who broke the silence, determination apparent in his voice. "Our mission remains unchanged. We're tasked with locating the plutonium inside that cave," he said, motioning towards the shadowy entrance. "While I understand the hesitancy considering the local folklore and the gruesome scene around us, our duty is clear. We cannot base our next move on speculation or superstitions." Jacob shot back, his voice laced with incredulity. "So we're just supposed to stroll in there, ignoring the likelihood that a mythical mountain spirit caused this?" He gestured emphatically at the deceased man, his final warning still ringing fresh. Derek's retort was sharp. "Our objective is clear. We can't determine for certain what transpired here, but I refuse to compromise a mission, especially one that could prevent a nuclear catastrophe based on an unverified account from a dying man. I respect the cultural beliefs of these people, but our task is imperative." His authority, combined with the urgency of the situation, quelled further objections. Bradley, Neil, Victor, and I opted to accompany Derek into the abyss. I I took a moment to ensure my rifle was primed and ready. The descent into the cave felt like a journey into the very bowels of the earth, every step a foray into the unknown. The chill of dread was palpable, exacerbated by the stifling stench of decay that grew more intense as we ventured deeper. Guided solely by the infrared illuminators on our rifles and our night vision equipment, the cave presented a macabre tableau. Grisly remnants of the unfortunate dotted our path, their final resting places a chilling testament to whatever horror had befallen them. The oppressive air and challenging terrain were physical trials, but the emotional toll of witnessing such brutality was even more demanding. Eventually, we entered a broader cavern with multiple exits. The daunting thought of splitting up, a situation that felt ripped straight out of a horror movie, was mercifully dispelled when Derek's infrared beam settled on a wooden crate. The all-too-familiar radiation symbol was hard to miss, even in our limited visibility. Derek and Victor busied themselves preparing demolition charges, intending to seal this grim vault once our task was done. Approaching the crate with caution, I delicately lifted its lid, revealing a metallic orb, its size reminiscent of a grapefruit, nestled securely. Contrary to its deadly reputation, plutonium in its solid state poses minimal risk unless ingested or inhaled. Still, I was not about to be careless. Retrieving a specially designed cloth bag from my pack, I gingerly placed the orb within, ensuring that it was safely contained. As I secured the plutonium, the reality of our situation hit home. We were caught between the pressing obligations of the present and the mysteries of a time long past, and there was no telling which would prove more treacherous. As I pivoted, a feeling akin to an anchor pulled at my feet. My experiences with the teams had exposed me to the brutal realities of warfare. Men torn apart, the final cries of the mortally wounded, and the palpable intent of an enemy charging forward. These memories, while haunting, had been compartmentalized into the recesses of my mind, allowing me to function and move forward. But the sight before me now was one for which no training, no prior experience could have ever prepared me. My eyes locked onto a creature, a grotesque amalgamation of man and monster, defying any logical categorization. Its appearance was like a twisted manifestation from the most deranged of nightmares, with its rough, unkempt fur, and arms and legs bending at such peculiar angles that it seemed to warp the space around it. The ominous clink of its foot-long claws, clicking softly on the rocky surface, made it clear that this beast was no mere figment of imagination. It was the visage of the creature, however, that truly paralyzed me. A void where a face should have been, a blackness so deep that it seemed as if the very essence of darkness had taken shape. But within that inky abyss, the gleam of rows upon rows of teeth stood out, dripping some viscous substance onto the cave floor below. Time lost meaning. Whether I stood frozen for seconds or minutes was impossible to gauge. It was Derek's whispered urgency that yanked me back to the chilling reality. His rifle was trained on the creature, fingers tense near the detonation switch linked to the explosives. The unspoken understanding was clear. Retreat was our only recourse. Hesitation, even for a fraction of a moment, proved almost catastrophic. As my boot pressed onto something soft and mangled, the beast responded. It didn't just move. It seemed to glitch through space, a series of erratic, quicksilver flashes. And then, a sound, so full of malevolence and rage, erupted from its formless face. A cacophony that felt like a chorus of souls trapped in endless torment. Before the echo of that cry faded, a hailstorm of bullets lit up the cavern, each muzzle flash a desperate beacon in our confrontation with this ancient terror. The creature, rather than being repelled, seemed to absorb the light, its very form a paradox of tangible darkness and razor-sharp dentition. Victor's desperate call, urging a retreat, still rings in my ears. He reached out, his fingers grazing my arm when, in a blur, the creature was upon him. One limb encircled his throat, lifting him effortlessly, while another punctured his torso, the tip emerging drenched in crimson. The reality of Victor's fate and the implications for our own survival crystallized in that horrifying moment. We were trapped in the lair of a predator unlike any the world had ever known. Victor's final moments were a brutal display of the creature's power and malevolence. His cries of desperation were cut short as he was savagely torn apart, his remains violently strewn across opposite walls. Such unimaginable violence threatened to unhinge my already fragile grip on sanity. Adrenaline surged through me, and instinct took over. My rifle was in my hands, its muzzle blazing with automatic fire, as I tried to provide some semblance of resistance. The creature's fluid movements were a terrifying ballet of predatory grace. Bradley was swiftly dispatched, his life extinguished with a brutal sweep of the monster's claw. Neil, despite evading the full force of the strike, was met with a deadly slash that sealed his fate. The sheer horror, the ruthless efficiency of this beast, hollowed out the last vestiges of strategy from my mind. It was primal, raw terror, and the need to survive that now dictated my actions. Derek and I, the remaining duo, became the creature's focal point. Its bloodlust palpable, it turned its faceless maw towards us. Despite its lack of discernible eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me. The next moments were a blur of motion and gunfire, my bullets aiming for what I could only assume was its face, sparks flying as they made contact with its impenetrable maw. Anticipation of imminent death gripped me as the creature bore down on me. The inevitability of its fatal strike, the anticipation of excruciating pain, consumed me. But instead, an unexpected force collided with my chest, propelling me backward, disorienting me for a split second. It was Derek, his body broken and torn, using the last vestiges of his strength in a desperate bid to shield me. His eyes, alight with grim determination, locked onto mine. With each ragged breath, blood misted from his mouth. Though he was gravely injured, his hand still grasped our trump card, the detonator. With incredible effort, despite the pool of blood in his throat, he mouthed a singular command, urging me to flee. Before full comprehension dawned, my legs were carrying me away, with Derek's sacrificial gunfire forming a desperate soundtrack to my escape. The enveloping silence that followed was abruptly and violently shattered by an earth-shattering explosion. The concussive force threatened to tear me apart from the inside, pushing and yanking at my very essence. It felt as if Derek's spirit was giving one last push, urging me to go on, to escape the hellish depths of that cave. I found myself ejected into daylight. The cavern's maw vomited me out, and a barrage of rocks and debris rained down. My body was racked with pain and dust choked my lungs. Every inch of me was in agony, every beat of my heart a painful reminder of the horrors I'd just escaped. The only resounding thought, echoing louder than the pain, was Derek's final act of defiance and his echoing command, "Go, go, go." A barrage of sensations consumed me, pain, heat, the unsettling realization of having witnessed something otherworldly. It was as if I had been submerged in deep water, every sense distorted, every movement sluggish. Yet slowly, like a diver ascending to the surface, my consciousness began to crystallize, revealing the weight of the chaos that had just transpired. Suddenly, hands gripped me, pulling me back into the waking world. My immediate instinct was defense. A surge of frenetic energy made me lash out, the thought of death's imminence so fresh in my mind. My fingers sought the hilt of my pistol, desperate to level it at whatever was before me. The sharp sting of a slap interrupted that thought, my face stinging with its impact. It was Jacob. He was a picture of strained urgency, his eyes wide with both concern and warning. His voice reached out to me, but it was muffled, lost in the torrential noise of my racing heart and the gush of blood echoing in my ears. When he pointed at the cave, dread clenched my stomach. But instead of the monstrosity I had anticipated, I was met with a sight that simultaneously brought relief and disbelief. The cave's entrance was obliterated, nothing more than a mound of rubble and dust. This moment of stillness was paradoxical, both fleeting and seemingly endless. Kneeling amidst the destruction, the weight of the reality threatened to crush me. It took another insistent shake from Jacob to pull me from this dazed stupor. We had to leave. The distant thudding of helicopter blades acted as an anchor, drawing me back to reality. As we trudged out, the melancholic wails of the wind echoed in the cavernous expanse, a mournful lament for those who had been lost. This was Afghanistan's tribute, a haunting serenade that intertwined with the heavy silence of the mountains. The official records of Operation Falcon would remain behind veils of confidentiality and bureaucratic jargon. As anticipated, a a sanitized version was released for the world. Our fallen comrades, Bradley, Neil, Victor, and Derek, were remembered as heroes, casualties of a fierce gunfight in some remote cave. Their valiant service was acknowledged with posthumous medals. But the true narrative of what transpired in that cavern remained locked away, known only to a select few. Most wanted the memories buried, the horror of that day forgotten, but not me. The shadows of that cave haunted every corner of my mind, refusing to let go. While some sought solace in silence, I yearned for catharsis. I needed to bear witness to the unspeakable terror that lay in the heart of those mountains. After my discharge, I knew the story had to be told. The shadow operatives of the government would undoubtedly attempt to suppress it, but the truth demanded to be heard. Afghanistan had its fair share of horrors, but what we encountered that day was beyond comprehension, a malevolence that challenged our understanding of reality. The world needed to know that amidst the known threats, there lurked something far more sinister, something unimaginably ancient and evil.